Well, hello and welcome to Insight with Political Tools, the travel company led by reporters around the world. Journalism is becoming an increasingly dangerous job, with reporters, photographers, researchers harassed, imprisoned, tortured, or even killed for doing their jobs, often because they're exposing stories that governments and other groups don't want you to know about. But can anything be done about it? Our next guest thinks something can. He's Peter Greste, the former Al-Jazeera correspondent who himself was imprisoned in Egypt on trumped-up charges in 2014. Hello and welcome, Peter. Good to have you with us. I can't hear you just for the moment. I don't know if your microphone is on or off. It may be off.
Yes.
There we go. There we go. Good to have you with us.
Thanks very much, and good evening to you, and good morning from Australia.
Yeah, you've had an extensive career. Many people will know you from your work with the BBC and then with Al Jazeera. We'll talk to you about what happened in Egypt in a bit, and we'll also talk about media freedom at length, really, in a bit. But to start with, just tell me how you got your first breaks in journalism. What interested you about it? What were your first jobs? What did you do?
I guess my interest in journalism really wasn't from writing. In fact, I remember I almost gave up my journalism studies when I started the course, when I met an old friend of mine, an old school friend, who asked me what I was doing. And I said I'd started a journalism course. And she said, "Oh, my God, that's endless English essays for the rest of your life." And I thought, Christ, she's right. I almost gave it away then until I realized that journalism was partly about the writing. But for me, what really excited me was the license to indulge a curiosity. The license to pretty much explore any issue, any place that really interested you, because if it interested me, then it was the chances were it would interest others. I did my journalism studies and got my first job in regional TV in Australia, and kicked around Australian newsrooms for a while until, I guess, my first big break. Which didn't feel like it at the time, but the network that I was working for went into receivership and they closed down the London bureau. And about that time, I'd read an extraordinary book by about a biography of a guy called Neil Davis, who was one of Australia's more celebrated journalists, a foreign correspondent who worked across Vietnam, worked across Southeast Asia during the early 60s and 70s and 80s. And that really inspired me. And when the network closed down the London bureau, I thought, well, look, you can't have one of the major Australian TV networks without a London correspondent. So I marched into my boss's office and said, look, if I resign and take myself to London, will you use me as a freelance? And he said, of course, why not? It didn't matter to him. That was one person he didn't have to sack, and they were going to get a London correspondent. And so that's what I did. I didn't do a great deal of work for them, but it was enough to get me to London, to plug me into the world of British journalism. And
what time are we talking about, Peter? When roughly years?
This was end of 1991 that I first went to London, and that was around the time, of course, that the war in Yugoslavia was taking off. And I guess my next big break was meeting a girl in a pub in London who I was rather smitten by. And turns out that she was a crazy Irish Catholic girl who was going off to a place called Medjugorje in Bosnia, which was a place of Catholic pilgrimage all the way through the conflict. And it struck me as an extraordinary story. And so I followed her into the war, quite literally.
So you got your break there, and you came to work for the BBC, and it really was a time, and particularly working with the BBC, where you had all access. You could go everywhere and really report on pretty much anything you wanted to.
Yeah, that's right. But at the time, what I did then in Yugoslavia was attach myself to BBC correspondents. I wasn't working for the BBC. I was working mostly for Australian networks at the time. My break with the BBC came in Afghanistan in 1994. Well, I applied for the job in 94. I went to Afghanistan as a correspondent in 95. And again, that was a bit of an accident where I wanted to get my CV across certain desks at World Service. And I thought rather than send it in randomly and have it go into the round file, I'd apply for a job. The job wasn't important, but when I didn't get it, then mentioned that I was interested in freelancing, and the first job I applied for was the Kabul correspondence job, and they gave it to me.
Wow.
Which was quite staggering, but it was really the thing that kicked off my career.
I want to move things forward a bit. I mean, I think in a way my career is not quite like yours, but it's a similar timing. I mean, I started off in about 92, 93. I covered Kosovo, the end of the wars in Bosnia as well. And I'm just trying to get that sense of when you think things began to change and there was a shift. I mean, obviously there's 9/11, which is absolutely enormous. But when did you start to think that your ability to perform that task as a journalist became more tricky, became more difficult?
You mentioned 9/11, and although I guess things had shifted a little bit perhaps before then, it feels to me as though 9/11 was that turning point. I really only understood it when I was imprisoned in Egypt. What was happening before, and you mentioned the ability of BBC and other journalists to work across the battlefield in Yugoslavia. And even though journalists were often targeted, particularly by the Serbs, it wasn't so much because of who they were as journalists, but because of what the militants, what the various forces were trying to keep hidden. That was a war over a tangible thing: land and ethnicity, land and religion. These are things that you could quite literally put your finger on. And that was the way with a lot of conflicts that I've covered over the years, whether it's places like Somalia, where it's a clan conflict, in Sudan, where it was a conflict over political power and land, all sorts of conflicts, often over tangible things. But what 9/11 did was create a conflict over ideas, over isms. George Bush declared the war on terror soon after 9/11. And that war on terror, I think, or that declaration of a war on terror, changed the dynamic very profoundly. What it did was create a war of ideas. And in that conflict over ideas, the battlefield extends to the place where ideas themselves are transmitted, and that is, by definition, the media. And so journalists are often suddenly become targets, not just because of the things that you're reporting, but because you're a part of that information dynamic, that information sphere. And I felt that what I could see then was the way in which journalists had been targeted in Afghanistan simply because they were journalists. I lost a couple of very close friends to an attack by the Taliban. The Taliban fighters who were responsible for that attack, and this was soon after 9/11 itself, during the conflict to push the Taliban out of Kabul. The fighters themselves were caught, and in court they acknowledged that they were acting on orders from the Taliban to explicitly go after journalists. Now that, if I can wind you back to 1995 when I was first in Afghanistan, I used to cross the front lines literally with impunity all the time when the Taliban were laying siege to the city. And that was because I was exercising, partly because I felt it was the right thing to do as a responsible journalist, but also because I wanted to exercise that right to report from both sides and make it clear to everybody that that was my role in the conflict. That became impossible after 9/11 because all of a sudden we became targets from the Taliban. The American government started dropped bombs on the Al-Jazeera bureau because Al-Jazeera had recorded the first interview with the one person I reckon that most journalists would have given their right arm to talk to, and that was Osama bin Laden. This is what journalists do. We cover all parts of the conflict, even if people think it's unpleasant.
Yeah. I mean, I could go back. I think we did an interview with John Swain, and we were going back to Vietnam and Cambodia, and he was talking about before the fall of Phnom Penh, and the journalists going down the road, go and report on the Khmer, and they would never come back again. They were just disappeared into, they were killed straight off. And I mean, I don't know if there's any distinction between that. It would seem to me they were targeted because they were journalists and they were interested in publishing, news. But you're saying that's you're saying that's okay. That's been a risk. That's always been something there, but it's never been as bad as it is now.
That's right. I'm not saying that this is the first time ever in the history of humankind that this has happened, but I think that what 9/11 did, what the war on terror did, was give license to governments to define terror and terrorism in very broad and often indistinct ways. It's a very, very difficult thing to actually put your finger on. And it is an idea. What we've seen then is governments. I mean, in Egypt, for example, we'll come to that, of course, in due course. But in Egypt, the government defined terrorism so loosely that it was anything that undermined the integrity of the state, and they then accused the opposition of being involved in acts of terror, and therefore, as journalists, if we spoke to the opposition, as you're supposed to do, we became guilty of advocating terrorist ideology. The CPJ, the Committee for the Protection of Journalists, does an annual survey of journalists behind bars. And there are two things to note. That first of all, that we're at record highs at the moment, about 363 journalists as of the last survey that the CPJ conducted, and that is a very conservative figure. And about 2/3 of them are there on what the CPJ loosely calls anti-state charges. So that's things like treason, sedition, crimes of violating national security, and terrorism. 2/3, excuse me. And I think that figure alone tells you the way in which governments have come to regard journalism as threats against the state. And I think that's a very, very serious problem.
Okay, I want to come back to that in a second, because I think, as you've highlighted, and you talk about this in your book, the first casualty there's Trump's, war on fake news is just much a part of it, as we could talk about the British government here targeting the media over Brexit, and then the horrendous end of it, Charlie Hebdo, being a journalist being assassinated. Let's talk about Egypt and what happened to you. You weren't expecting to be there in Egypt at this time. It was a sort of short-term assignment, am I right in saying?
Yeah, that's right. My main bureau was East Africa, was Nairobi. I was the East Africa correspondent for Al-Jazeera. And I'd been called up to the Cairo bureau just to tread water. Al-Jazeera was short-staffed at the time over the Christmas-New Year period of 2013 into 2014. There was an ongoing political crisis at the time. The Muslim Brotherhood had won the previous elections back in the middle of 2012, the first democratic elections in Egypt's history. And even though it was controversial, they were indisputably the most potent political force in the country at the time. But they'd been forced out of power in a coup by the middle of 2013. And so when I arrived, what we saw was widespread street protests, clashes between the supporters of the Brotherhood and supporters of the military-backed government that had been installed as an interim administration. And my job was really just to keep stories ticking over, just to cover the events as they unfolded for a few weeks over that Christmas-New Year period until someone else could come in. So yeah, it was only going to be a fairly brief assignment.
And when you were detained, perhaps people watching this won't realize it, but it's actually almost a regular part of things when you're in a conflict zone, or if you're dealing with a fairly authoritarian regime. It's not unusual to get arrested. It's not unusual to be detained and given hassle, but you don't think it's going to last that long. You always think you can probably get out of it some way or other.
Yeah, usually governments generally recognize that arresting a foreign national of any sort is a big deal, because it invokes all sorts of, it almost invariably triggers some kind of diplomatic crisis. And arresting a foreign journalist is also particularly problematic. And so usually what happens is that, they're just trying to rattle the cage, just trying to send a very clear message, back off, don't cover these areas, don't do this kind of work. And often it's a few hours in the cells, perhaps a night or so, and then a trip to the airport at the very worst. And so I really felt that it was going to be over reasonably quickly. And keep in mind, I had done what I'd consider to be vanilla journalism, because it wasn't an area that I knew well, because I wasn't so deeply involved and enmeshed in the politics. I was playing with a very straight bat. The government would announce some changes to the constitution. We'd pick up the phone and call the opposition to get their response, and then speak to a specialist and expert.
And how many weeks had you been there when you were detained?
Just 2 weeks.
2 weeks. So since then, have you come to the conclusion, or have you spoken to people in Egypt who basically say you were arrested because you were a big name?
No, I've come to the conclusion that we were arrested not because of anything that we had done, or necessarily because of my name, but because I worked for Al-Jazeera, because we were politically convenient. At the time, the Egyptian government had accused Qatar of meddling in Egypt's internal affairs. Qatar had been a very vocal supporter of the Muslim Brotherhood when it took over after when it won those elections. There were signs that the Qatari government was continuing to support the Brotherhood. Al Jazeera, of course, is financed by Qatar, and therefore, as far as the Egyptians were concerned, we were somehow engaged in that kind of broader conspiracy. But Nick, the gap between what we'd actually been doing, that very vanilla journalism, and the reality of the charges that we were facing, I think was so wide that nobody could really have come to the conclusion that we're engaged in acts of terrorism or even engaged in some kind of conspiracy. And the charges were not laid against Al Jazeera, they were laid against us personally. And so I always felt that in the end, if you wanted to make a case about Qatari malfeasance in Egypt, then it made no sense to come after an Australian journalist who'd only been in Egypt for a couple of weeks. There are plenty of other people who you could have made that case with some credibility. It really wasn't about anything that we had done or in fact, who I was working for. That was a kind of political convenience for the Egyptians. But it was really about what we represented, and that was a free press.
The three of you were sentenced to between 7 and 10 years, a very heavy sentence. I'm thinking of this now because I'm thinking of what's going on now in Israel and Gaza, and the number of people who've been taken hostage, been kidnapped. You must think of them. You were held in pretty appalling conditions. How have you reacted to what's been going on?
Oh, I feel viscerally sick, literally sick in my stomach every time I think about those hostages. I don't think it takes a great leap of imagination to put yourself in those shoes. But after having been through what I've experienced, I understand the sheer terror, the disorientation, the loss of agency, the loss of control, the sense that you could die at any moment. All of that is absolutely sickening in a way that's really physical for me.
Just describe what actually happened to you during that time. You were held both in solitary confinement and also in mass confinement.
Yeah, I was pushed in the early stages in police cells that were the first one was one of the first cells I was in was a police cell that was about 8 foot square in the old numbers, perhaps 2 meters. Completely vacant, completely bare of any furniture, just a concrete box with a slightly leaky sink in one corner, and a stinky squat toilet in another, and the door, and that was pretty much it. And in that box, in that 8 foot square box, there were 16 guys. It was just extraordinarily crowded. We couldn't all sit down together at the same time. We couldn't, much less lie down. The light was on 24/7 in that cell. And there were some people who'd been in there for the better part of 6 months, and they were quite literally going crazy. And then from there into a period of solitary confinement, which of course is its own form of torture. The UN recognises solitary confinement as a form of torture, as a human rights abuse. It was pretty scary for periods there.
So you came out of that. I mean, that's cutting a very long story short, and also your colleagues were released after you as well. You came out of that. I mean, with determination, and that's quite something. With a sense that you actually could do something about what was happening, but also you had, as we've been talking about earlier, a perception that this was part of a much broader picture.
Yeah, look, I felt there were two things. I was released long before my colleagues, and I felt I had a commitment to keep fighting, to keep the campaign going, to help them out of prison. Eventually, that worked, but I also felt once I'd started it that I needed to keep going. Part of that was a sense of bloody-mindedness. The Egyptians wanted to shut us up, and so I felt that every time I had a microphone, an audience, a stage, it was a chance of flipping a middle finger at the Egyptians and saying, "Look, screw you! You've actually made it worse for yourselves. You've given me a profile and a cause and an audience, and I'm going to continue to use that." But I also felt that once I understood what was happening, once I recognized what I've come to see as a kind of global war on journalism, I felt an obligation to keep talking about it, to keep advocating for it, to make people recognize and understand it. I think at the moment it's very, very difficult for people to see a problem of media freedom, particularly in the Western world. And you mentioned countries like the US, the UK, and France, and so on, where people open up their mobile phones, and if anything, they feel that the media has too much freedom, not too little. There's a fire hose of news and information pouring out. But when you understand the ways in which national security has been weaponized and the way that governments have attacked journalism as a way of discrediting critical reporting on the governments and undermining, frankly, what is widely recognized as one of the main pillars of democracy, then you realize how important it is to fight back. I think it's incredibly important that we continue to speak up about this, because in the noise on social media and in the digital world, it's easy to lose sight of just how important, how fundamental good journalism really is.
Okay, and that's I think an interesting sort of transition, because we have been talking about, when we talk about your earlier career, we're talking about these big bastions of media freedom in terms of TV companies, newspapers. That's the sort of traditional media world. And yet there's now this enormous, with the internet, very obviously, most people can go online and contribute information in some kind or other. And so there's this enormous challenge, and it's been an enormous dilution of who the media are. So there's an additional part to this. It's not just the fact that you've got actors, states, groups who want to denigrate, who see a journalist as part of the problem. It's that journalism itself has become difficult to define.
Yeah, that's right. And I think that's one of the real challenges of our age at the moment, is trying to understand, trying to distinguish between journalists and other people who are producing work that looks very much like journalism, but for whatever reason simply doesn't make the grade. And I think there's a new approach that we should be taking. One of the problems that most governments have been grappling with is trying to define who is a journalist. And in a digital world, where anybody with a smartphone is capable of producing journalism-like content, that's become a very, very difficult problem. How do you create a network of laws? How do you identify the people that you're trying to protect when you're trying to enshrine journalists or journalism and media freedom in law? I've taken a fairly radical approach, but I think it's an important approach. I'd say that it's impossible to define who is a journalist any longer without shutting out people who should be included, and at the same time embracing those who simply really don't deserve the protection of the law. How do you deal with people like Russia Today, a network which is run by the Russian government, financed by the Russian government, and clearly producing Russian government propaganda. When you switch it on, it looks very much like BBC World Service, CNN, ABC Australia. But of course, it really isn't. It's a qualitatively very different kind of news service. How do you distinguish the work that some of the BBC's finest investigative journalists produce? How do you distinguish that from a kind of ratbag who's on YouTube, or somebody rather, not necessarily ratbag, but someone who is?
So
on
how
YouTube.
do you, and who decides?
Well, so, in my view, the who is a fool's errand. We shouldn't be trying to define who is a journalist. What really matters isn't the person that you're trying to protect; it's the role that journalism plays in a democracy, and that's underpinned by the methodology that journalists use to produce the information. Journalism, if we think of journalism as a process rather than as a person, then I think we are much closer to what really matters. And that's not particularly controversial. Journalism as a process is defined in most codes of conduct that you'll see in all sorts of news organizations, journalism, professional associations, unions, and so on. It's a fidelity to the truth. It's a fidelity to balance, to accuracy, to fairness. Those sorts of concepts. If you are accountable, if you uphold a set of a code of conduct that's widely recognised, and you are accountable in some way, and accountability, I think, is absolutely key here, then I think you are producing. There's a fair chance that you are producing journalism, and I think most other people who would like to pretend or present themselves as journalists but aren't making the grade probably wouldn't be accountable to a code of conduct.
Okay, so can you give us a concrete example? Let's say I write some kind of blog and I'm doing reporting on what I think is a sort of corrupt local government housing scheme. Just making this up as I go along. What makes me a proper journalist in your view?
Well, Nick, what I would say is that if you are accountable to a code of conduct, if you make yourself, whether it's through a membership of a union or some other organization, where you say, look, here is my code of conduct. And if I'm posting my blog on a website, on the website there is somewhere on the website there is that code of conduct, and a place where you can click and complain if you think I'm violating my code of conduct. And that code says that you are committed to accuracy, to fairness, to balance, to right of reply, to all of those things, and you are producing your blog that is consistent with that code, then I think you can claim to be producing journalism.
Okay, and then the second part of this, your equation, as it were, to protect media freedom. So the first bit is defining what journalism is in this confusing world, and the second part is giving those people who subscribe to those codes some kind of protection.
That's right, and this is where it's a problem, particularly in Australia, where we don't have any explicit protections for media freedom. There are other codes. Media freedom generally around the world is protected through the various human rights acts, as freedom of expression. Article 19 of the UN Human Rights Charter famously protects freedom of expression that includes press freedom. And there are variations of that around the world, but what we don't often see is it articulated in law in a way that explicitly protects journalism in the way that I think about it. Because there is no concrete definition that now actually works, most governments don't use the kind of definition that I'm talking about. It gives space for governments to crack down on uncomfortable reporting. In Australia, we are working on a draft legislation, a Media Freedom Act, that would explicitly protect media freedom in the way that, in very broad ways, in very broad terms, but also uses that process definition as a key to defining what it is that we're trying to protect. And I think that has the potential to really revolutionize the relationship between the media and government.
Okay, we've got questions coming, and I do encourage people to put questions in the Q&A box. Peter and I both know Lynn Maddock. Lynn, you're there, and I'm actually going to turn the tables on you, Lynn. Do you mind if I say what you do briefly?
Oh, sure, Nicholas, that's fine.
Yeah, and
Hi,
so
Peter.
you work on Australia's. You help with Australia's press. What's the word for it? What's the term for it in Australia? What do you call it in Australia?
Press Council.
Press Council, that's it. So is Peter an idealist? Is he barking up the wrong tree? Is there some kind of consensus building around this idea that you can enshrine? Obviously, there's the UN Charter there that gives this right elsewhere, both in terms of his definition of what journalism should be and the rights that should be given to them.
I've not heard Peter talk about that before, but just a declaration of interest. Peter and I both serve on the Press Council, so we're colleagues as well as mates, I hope. I think what Peter's saying makes an awful lot of sense. I mean, from a practical point of view, as a press regulator, you do need some way of deciding how you distinguish between the trivial gossip magazine and the real journalism in the way Peter's talking about. And I think that's a really good start, what he's talking about, as a way of doing that.
If people subscribe to a code of conduct or some kind of accepted code of ethics.
Yeah, and that's the way the Press Council in Australia works, but it's full of tensions at the edges of that.
Okay. Now, Lynn, I know you had a question which is more about governments and foreign nationals. So I don't know if you want to sort of tweak your question at all, if you still had that question, it's still relevant.
I mean, I'm still interested in the point you made, Peter, about how governments used to be more reluctant to arrest for any substantial time foreign nationals because of the diplomatic furore that happens, and whether that dynamic has changed with governments more willing to do that nowadays, and if so, why is that accelerating?
Well, yeah, I think that they are, then. Let's be very clear, the vast majority of journalists in prison are local journalists. But we are seeing quite a few examples of foreign journalists being detained, both by governments and by militants. There's fewer militants now, largely, Islamic State was responsible for chopping the heads off quite a few journalists in recent years. But what we're seeing is, and this goes back to, I think, the war on terror, which has given governments the kind of rhetorical instruments that they can use to justify the imprisonment of journalists. Evan Gerskovich, the Wall Street Journal reporter who was covering, the Wall Street Journal reporter who was covering Russia, who's been arrested by the Russians on espionage charges, is I think a classic case in point. There's another Australian journalist, Cheng Lei, who's been detained in China, also on espionage charges. Now, we don't know the details of either of those. In the absence of any detail or in the absence of any evidence, it's really hard to see it as anything other than an excuse to come after both uncomfortable journalism, but also to use them as diplomatic pawns, but using that war on terror, that national security rhetoric, as a kind of top cover. And I think the war on terror has created that kind of, as I said, that kind of rhetorical space in ways that didn't exist before 9/11.
I'd love to get more questions, people, so please do put them in the Q&A box. Peter, coming back to this idea of this huge dilution of media and how people get their news, there's a greater emphasis on quality. Can you just explain that and how? It sounds slightly elitist in some way, but you think this is now more important than ever. There are a few, but very, very important sources of high quality news.
Yeah, and I think that's that's really, really vital. One of the things that we often see is a lack of, so around the world, and this isn't absolutely true globally, of course, but generally speaking, we don't have, around the world, there are a lot of professional associations that distinguish, say, accountants or engineers, professional accountants and professional engineers from others. Those associations acknowledge those professionals who meet certain standards. They run programs of professional development. They run complaints mechanisms to deal with any of their members who might not be making the grade. They provide a standard that the public can recognise. They allow their members to badge themselves as members of a professional association, and that makes it easier for the public to identify those kinds of professionals and have greater confidence in their work. There is very few organisations like that for journalists around the world, and I think that if we took that process definition that I mentioned earlier, if that was enshrined in law, and we had then professional associations that used that process definition as the basis for membership, then what you might have is a system where people are able to recognise both journalists who meet the standard that are recognised by their peers, and give the courts, give governments an opportunity also to identify journalism that's done to a standard. The crucial key to this system is that nobody is shut out of producing content. One of the things that we need to be, that I emphasise, is that nobody should have their freedom of speech limited. Nobody should be stopped from publishing anything. What we're simply saying, what we're trying to do is develop a system of identifying good journalism that makes the standard. And that way, not only can the public identify work that makes the grade, but also social media companies have the capacity to have a tool really to boost content up the rankings as good journalism. I think what I'm trying to do is come up with a system that privileges quality journalism, quality reporting, and encourages it without shutting out anybody else. And I think that kind of model really works. It's important if we understand why good journalism matters to a democracy. People get very cynical about journalists and journalism. They think that we are a part of the problem. And I guess in a lot of respects, bad journalism is a part of the problem. But we also need to remind ourselves how governments, how our democracies might look if we didn't have good, free, independent journalism. If a lot of the reporting that exposed abuses within government, that exposed mismanagement of government, that exposed corruption in government simply didn't exist. That kind of reporting only exists because we've got good professional journalists who understand their craft and who apply it consistently and ethically.
That reminds me of one thing, is that when your colleagues, Mohamed and I'm sorry, I've forgotten your name, your other, were released, you were actually on a game show in Australia, which from my perspective, I find that very odd. I see that as the journalist as star, media personality. And for me, that's sort of, that's crossing a line. But I think you see the role, what you're saying is in this modern world, a journalist it's not about impartiality. It's not about sort of being anonymous. It's actually about being active.
Yeah, so a couple of things. Remember, but keep in mind that that was very soon after I was released, and I had a very high public profile, and there was a lot of interest in me as a former detainee and the messages that I was saying, and the campaign also that I was pushing for my colleagues' release. But yes, in broad terms, I don't think there was a point at which, a time in fairly recent history, when journalists were considered. When it was considered a mistake for journalists to have any kind of obvious involvement in a story, to take the kind of eye of God approach, as if everything that journalists were saying and writing was objective truth. I think that is a myth. It's something that I talk to my students a lot about. I don't think it is possible for there to be there is such a thing as objective reality. Journalists are always making subjective choices, even if it's around the order of information that they put into a story. The most important stuff goes at the top of a story, but that's a subjective choice. The questions you ask, the questions you don't ask, all of them are subjective choices. And so I think it's important to acknowledge the role of journalists in the stories, to place yourself not necessarily at the front of a story. I think it's wrong for journalists to be the stars themselves, but I also think it's right and appropriate for journalists to be clearly in the story in some way, whether it's someone who is going through a particular experience or who is able to put a degree of analysis in there. But
you're saying something more fundamental than that. You're saying basically that the Fourth Estate, the reporters are a fundamental part of upholding democracy, and they shouldn't be afraid of playing that role and playing it in different ways.
Yeah, absolutely. And it is an institution that we all recognise and acknowledge as key to a democracy. It's democracy 101. The media is the Fourth Estate, alongside the executive, the judiciary, and the parliament. And I think that when you understand that, we need to recognise both its importance, but journalists themselves need to be able to fight for that corner and remind both governments and the public why it matters. Of those four pillars, I think journalism is by far and away the weakest. It's the one that's most under assault, particularly since the digital revolution. But I still think it is vitally important that we maintain and protect it.
Okay, I'm going to take another question. I am going to go on and ask Peter some questions about Gaza and Israel. We both have quite a bit of experience, or some experience, of reporting there, and I just thought it would be interesting, obviously, with the horrendous events taking place there at the moment, to talk to him a bit about that. So we'll talk about Gaza and Israel in just a second. Marty Ryan, Marty, you've got a question, but I've got a question for you to start with. Where do you get your news from? Where do you go to your news most days?
I get it from National Public Radio. I have the subscriptions to the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Guardian, the Atlantic. So
really, these are quite traditional media sources, aren't they? I mean, those are big institutions that have been there for a long time.
Yes.
So you're not very representative of the younger generation and nor the new media circus.
Absolutely not. I spend no time on social media.
Okay, well, I'm probably in the same boat as you, but actually I mean, Twitter actually is a major source for me, a huge source for me. Particularly, I actually find during on breaking news stories, particularly following the Middle East and some of that's horrendous, I was actually able to see more news, and you can't verify all of it, coming on through Twitter than I did before it came up on in the New York Times or in the BBC. So it's there's competition there. Marty, you've got a question. Go ahead with your question.
Yes. In the U.S., at least, there has been an ongoing and serious diminishment of investigative reporting, and I can't put my finger on when it started, but I do believe it's connected to the shift from print media to online media. But my question to you is this happening elsewhere? And would you speak to your views on investigative reporting and how much or little of it is being done?
Yeah, Marty, I think you're absolutely right on both counts. It is diminishing. And it is diminishing globally, and it is also diminishing because of the rise of social media, the digital revolution. And there are a couple of very simple reasons for that. First of all, in the pre-digital era, a lot of news organizations were treated as, had what they called rivers of gold, which was the advertising revenue, the classified advertising revenue. And that revenue went into places that were completely disconnected from the journalism itself. If you wanted to take out an ad in the New York Times to sell your apartment, then you weren't particularly worried about what was on the front pages, and likewise, the journalists really didn't care, were completely disconnected from the advertisers. Now, so that created huge amounts of money for, and it also liberated the journalists of the editorial side of the business from the pressures, the commercial pressures. What the digital revolution did was completely wipe out that revenue source and force journalists to produce content that in and of itself would pay. Investigative journalism is massively expensive. It's hugely time-consuming. It often takes journalists years to uncover some of the biggest stories that they're investigating. It's very, very difficult to justify that kind of reporting in a world where each story has to generate revenue, whether it's through clicks and display advertising, where most of the money goes to Google in the end, or Google and Facebook, or through subscriptions. Here in Australia, some of the news organisations, and I'm pretty sure it works the same in most parts of the world, news organisations reward their journalists according to the number of subscriptions that their stories generate, and there are certain KPIs that are tied to their journalists, where they have to generate X number of subscriptions per month to even keep their jobs, or at least get any bonus. And of course, what you're going to do in that world is try and produce stories that generate subscriptions and generate clicks. And those sorts of stories privilege speed over accuracy, polemic over serious analysis, the sensational over the sober. It certainly doesn't privilege the long, slow, difficult, and expensive investigations. Without serious revenue sources, it's almost impossible for editors who are trying to keep their businesses afloat and their journalists employed to commission those kinds of very difficult, expensive investigations. Some big news organizations like the New York Times and Washington Post and others still have the revenue streams because they've found a way of generating large amounts of subscriptions globally to keep themselves afloat and to pay for that kind of journalism. But that is not reproducible in a way that delivers investigative journalism across the industry.
The organizations that I can think of outside of, Western Europe, the United States, that have done really impressive journalism. I'm thinking, I can't remember the name of the organization in Beirut that exposed the central bank governor's corruption. And then there's, I think, Bellingcat to a degree in Russia. And then there's the Balkan Investigative Reporting Network. They're all funded by NGO. They basically have fundraising. They're independent of that, and it's due to various people's generosity that they're able to do that kind of work. But they're very vulnerable.
Yeah, that's right, and it's that convergence of revenue source and journalism that's created the problem. What you've just described, Nick, is a situation where philanthropy has funded a lot of that kind of good journalism and also maintained a degree of distance between them. I mean, I think the reason the Washington Post survives isn't because the Washington Post manages to generate huge amounts of subscriptions. It's because Jeff Bezos bankrolls it. And that in itself is problematic as well, because Jeff Bezos has his own political interests that have the potential to undermine the integrity of and independence of the journalism. And so, we need to, I think, somehow collectively rethink how we finance journalism. If you believe that journalism has a public good, it has a role to play in democracy, it cannot play that role if it is beholden to commercial pressures in the way that we see it at the moment.
So you really think that there should be some kind of, it's like the fourth estate is part of the legitimacy of the state, and therefore the state should be contributing to it in some ways. In other words, taxpayers should be helping it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are ways of doing it. And I think the BBC model is actually very, very good, conceptually at least. We're starting to move into radical territory here, Nick.
Yeah.
But just briefly, the BBC, of course, the funding comes from the license fee. That's, for those who don't know, that's a fee that people pay, or a license that people pay to own a television. Of course, that in a digital world is pretty nonsensical, and the license fee is almost certainly on the way out. But if you step back and think about it conceptually, what you've got is a source of revenue that's tied to the way that people consume the news and information that is completely ring-fenced from either government pressure or commercial interests. And people have been willing to pay it because they recognise the importance of having that kind of source of revenue for a publicly funded and publicly accountable news and information and entertainment service. I'm not saying that all news should be funded that way, but I think that there is a case to argue that you could direct money from digital subscriptions, for example, from the cost of data, into some kind of central fund that you could use to underwrite, to a certain extent, commercial news services, and therefore make them accountable to a very real extent to the public that they're supposed to be serving. I mean, there are all sorts of ways of thinking about it, but fundamentally what we need to do is rethink the way that we finance. We need to rethink and recognise the importance of good independent journalism that is free of both commercial and political pressure. And then, and if you accept that premise, then rethink how we direct money to it. And I think it has to come from the public it is meant to serve, not necessarily the governments, because again, that we know that tends to corrupt it as well.
Okay. There's a Chinook flying overhead, so my camera is being distracted. We live near a helicopter training ground, so every now and then we hear the thump, thump, thump of helicopters going ahead. I'm going to change tack quite drastically. Both Peter and I have some experience of the Middle East. And Peter, just tell me a bit about yours. You spent some time in Israel and Gaza. What were you doing there?
I was covering the Gaza Strip for a few months for the BBC, again, between correspondents. This was soon after Hamas took over control of the Gaza Strip back in 2007. And it was a really enlightening and really quite disturbing period for me, both in terms of seeing the way that Hamas had exercised control over the Gaza Strip, but also the way in which the Israeli blockade of Gaza really changed the psychology of the Palestinians who were living there at the time.
What kind of place does it look like? I mean, I can chip in as well.
Well, as you know, it's one of the most densely populated places on Earth. There are more than 2 million Palestinians now living in a patch of territory that I think is about 36 square kilometers. It's incredibly tiny. It's a ramshackle maze of poorly built buildings all jammed in together on top of one another. Incredibly densely populated, and it really it's become a bit of a cliched description now. But I remember very clearly when I was there that it really did feel like an open air prison, particularly when you go through the Israeli checkpoints to both enter and leave the place.
I remember going through the areas crossing, and there's a sort of no man's land. I mean, Gaza's very built up on the eastern side of it, and then it's got agricultural land going up to the wall. One of the things that really strikes me is, and I was just thinking about coming through that crossing, and I saw that crossing on TV, on the video with Hamas taking over it. And then there's that sort of almost like sort of no man's land until you get to the more built up areas. One of the things that really strikes me is that when you look at the pictures of Gaza, how little it has changed. I was there in that 2000, a year, possibly a year after you, in 2008, writing a report for Human Rights Watch. And if you look at the video of, Jabalia refugee camp or Gaza City or some of its main roads, they haven't changed. There's no real, it hasn't changed. The development hasn't changed at all. And it's though a place has been frozen in grey, concrete grey, for 17 years. And the fact also that Israel has cut off the water and the electricity says a lot, and that's who has control over the water and the electricity supplies to that region. It's Israel. So I find that shocking.
Yeah, and I think what's, as I said, what's key is the impact on the psychology of people in Gaza. And I'm not for a second justifying Hamas's attack on Israel. But I think we also need to recognize that that it has a huge psychological pressure. It creates a massive amount of resentment and anger and bitterness that is very, very difficult. And what we've seen, in the past few days, is just how difficult it is to suppress human response, human backlash in that kind of environment. That some way or other, people will inevitably find a way to strike back if they're held in those kinds of extraordinarily pressured conditions.
I'm struck. I mean, the two words that come up to me is dignity and humiliation. And then the other thought that I think of is my other thought pops into my head is that people would describe what these people have done as evil. But I actually see how you get people to do extreme things when they're cattled in. There's no justification at all. What's happened is truly, truly horrendous. I was reading an article by Kim Gattas in the Financial Times about the parallels with Beirut and Lebanon in 1982, and I'm hesitant or fearful about the idea of Israel going in and trying to take over the Gaza Strip again and crush Hamas. And I don't know if you've got any views on that.
Yeah, I think what we've seen is the way in which it's almost, what the Israelis have said, what I've heard is that they want to try and decapitate Hamas, to replace Hamas with some kind of more moderate administration. And frankly, I think that is impossible. What I've seen around the world, whether it's in Gaza or in places like Somalia, for example, or West Africa, is that where you place people under pressure, you create radicalism. I want to be very quick I want to be very clear that I'm not suggesting that Israel in some way is responsible for the attack. What I am arguing is that those kinds of policies create a psychology that is very, very difficult to suppress, and that you end up with radical violence coming back. Now, we will not. I predict that if the Israelis continue the kind of policies that they've conducted, they try and screw down the pressure cooker. That pressure cooker at some point will increase. The pressure will increase, and it will ultimately explode again at some point. That to me, that strikes me as simply as an inevitable consequence. I recognize why Israel takes the approach that it does, because it does feel, when you've got an organization like Hamas, which is dedicated to its destruction, it clearly feels very, very fearful and feels a need to respond forcefully and robustly. But I think that, and I think that's the point that Kim was trying to make, that ultimately you cannot destroy these kinds of ideas. You cannot simply wipe out radicalism by placing people under pressure.
We've got one question coming back now to media freedom and all sorts of ethics. Joyce Kirk has got a quick last question for you. Go ahead, Joyce.
Thanks very much, Nicholas. Peter, I'm just interested in what a defamation law would look like in the context of the code that you described earlier. And I have in mind, some of the recent defamation cases in Australia, some of which were bankrolled by wealthy media proprietors and so on, some of which have involved raids on journalists' houses and so on. But what would a defamation law look like in the rather idealistic world that you have in mind?
I'm going to chip in there. You've got to bear in mind also Prigozhin sued British journalists through British courts for saying that he was linked to an organisation called Wagner. Mm-hmm. So and the courts are quite happy to take the case. Peter.
Yeah, and I think, Joyce, two things. respectfully, I'm not. I think that I'm arguing for a much more pragmatic approach rather than an idealistic one. I agree that there's idealism involved, but I think it is a much more pragmatic approach and a practical one that we can use. And I think the other thing that's worth pointing out is that the media proprietors that bankrolled the defamation cases you mentioned were supporting the plaintiffs in this case, in the case that you're thinking of, rather than the media defendants, which was a bit of a turnaround. I think, it's an interesting question. The issue of defamation. Defamation is often used as a way of silencing journalism, and it tends to be only the rich and powerful that use defamation cases to try and defend their reputations, or at least suppress uncomfortable reporting, uncomfortable journalism. I think the emphasis on ethics and standards could form the basis of whether we regard reporting as worthwhile or not worthwhile. I think that I still think that there is. I don't think that what I'm proposing would necessarily change defamation fundamentally. What it would do, though, is place the emphasis on the methodology that journalists use, and also create an opportunity for arguing powerfully in the public interest, reporting in the public interest in ways that are not available to us at the moment.
In British law, it's the other way around. The emphasis on the journalist, for example, to prove that they have not defamed someone, rather than the victim showing that they've been damaged in some way or other.
Yeah, and that's pretty much the way it is in Australia too. That the balance of power in the defamation suit is almost invariably with the plaintiffs. Journalists have to prove truth, but up until recently, truth alone wasn't its own defence. In Australia, we now have a public interest defence that still remains largely untested. In the case that Joyce was mentioning, it was one of Australia's, arguably Australia's most famous soldier, living soldier, a guy called Ben Robert Smith, who was a winner of the Victoria Cross, the highest military award that can be given in Australia. But he was also accused of war crimes in Afghanistan, of murdering unarmed Afghan civilians, and he tried to suppress the reporting about his alleged war crimes using defamation. The news organisations took the unusual step of using the truth defence, and in court the judge finally ruled that the allegations were substantially true, that they were to the standard of proof that was required in a civil court, which is less than the standard in a criminal court, but they found that the allegations were substantially true, and so the news organisations won the case. I think that one of the reasons that clearly one of the reasons the news organisations won was because of the integrity of their reporting. And so a model, in my view, that places the emphasis on quality and standards rather than on professional affiliation or whatever you put on your business card is an important development.
Peter, this has been fantastic. Thank you very much. We've really covered a huge amount in the last hour. I'm grateful also for you talking about Gaza and Israel as well. But it's been a fantastic discussion. The book you wrote was called The First Casualty, and I think it's certainly available in Australia, and I think it's you can get it on Amazon. So if anyone wants to read more about both what happened to Peter in 2014 and what it pushed him to do afterwards, have a look at that. And your organisation is called, just fill us in if people want to go into your website and have a look at what you're doing now.
It's called the Alliance for Journalist Freedom, and we advocate for media freedom across Australia and the Asia Pacific region.
Fantastic. Peter, thank you. It's been wonderful. Thank you very much indeed.